Welcome to the Modern Mexico Podcast. I'm your host, Nathaniel Parish. On today's episode of the podcast, we're talking about Ismael Zambada, a man better known by his nickname, El Mayo. El Mayo is perhaps the last of his generation of old-school cartel bosses. He has served as a behind-the-scenes leader for the Sinaloa Cartel. El Mayo was arrested in El Paso, Texas on July 25, 2024. He claimed he was abducted on his way to a meeting with the governor of Sinaloa, adding fuel to allegations about the direct ties between Mexico's top politicians and cartel bosses. BBC News covered El Mayo's arrest.
One of the world's most powerful drug cartel leaders appeared in a Texas federal court on Friday. Ismael El Mayo Zambada, leader of Mexico's Sinaloa Cartel, pleaded not guilty on all charges after being arrested by U.S. federal agents in Texas on Thursday. The 76-year-old founded the criminal organization with Joaquin El Chapo Guzman, who is currently jailed in the U.S. Also arrested Thursday alongside Mr. Zambada was the son of the notorious El Chapo Guzman, Joaquin Guzman Lopez. American prosecutors say the Sinaloa cartel is the biggest supplier of drugs to the United States.
In the weeks following El Mayo's arrest, the city of Culiacan in Sinaloa exploded in violence. ABC News covered the battles in Sinaloa.
So let's start with just what's going on, mainly in the city of Culiacan. That is the state capital of Sinaloa. Sinaloa is, of course, the heartland of the Sinaloa Cartel country, if you will. And what we've seen within the last 2 weeks or so is just an explosion of infighting within this cartel, faction versus faction. And what it has done is left dozens of people dead. Officially, the number is around 40 at this point, but that's just officially. Anytime you're talking about deaths and organized crime, there are always deaths that are not reported officially. So the number is likely far higher than that. What we've been learning so far is that the majority of people who have been killed do appear to be involved with the cartel, not just ordinary civilians, but that's in part because civilians are basically staying home. Schools were closed last week. They only reopened this past Tuesday with heavy government patrols in the region. You had businesses shut down. The public transportation is empty. Even last weekend, Mexican Independence Day celebrations were formally canceled because of this fighting. So the population is basically cowed into staying inside their homes as this cartel continues to go to war with itself.
On today's episode of the podcast, we're speaking to historian Benjamin Smith, the author of the book The Dope, The Real History of the Mexican Drug Trade. Hi, Ben. So this is actually the first time I can say welcome back to the podcast, because you're actually the first guest who is coming back for a second time.
Well, thank you very much. Enjoyed it last time. Hope it goes as well.
So I wanted to start off by asking, why is El Mayo's arrest so significant?
So El Mayo has had a very long history, a history of almost 5 decades in the drug business. He started off in the 1970s. He got into the drug business in a slightly interesting way. He's not, unlike people like Chapo or Caro Quintero or Nestor Fonseca, he's not from the uplands of Sinaloa. He's not from the mountains. He's actually from lowland Sinaloa, and he really inherited his drug business through his brother-in-law, who was a Cuban cocaine supplier that his sister married. When this cocaine supplier was eventually arrested in the United States, it looks that Mayo basically adopted many of his contacts. And over the next 2 or 3 decades, he became a major exporter of cocaine, mostly into the west coast of the United States. He operated for some time in Los Angeles. However, over the last decade or so, Mayo's importance has not been that specifically of a major exporter of drugs, but more as a key mediator between the Sinaloa Cartel, that is the group of criminal organizations that operate out of Sinaloa. That's not quite a cartel. And both the federal and the state government. He's much more of a political figure now, and I think this is partly why people are very worried about what's going to happen in Sinaloa.
So I can say that in the aftermath of his arrest, the video footage that we're seeing come out from Culiacan has been pretty shocking. It's really the imagery of a country at war. We're seeing caravans of heavily armed gunmen in military attire battling with each other. And I think that this current situation really highlights the danger that lurks beneath the surface when you have some type of negotiated peace agreement between local political elites and powerful organized crime groups. And I actually visited Culiacan earlier this year and I talked about it on episode 20 of the podcast. And I think that for me, something that's really surprising is how much investment there has been in real estate in Culiacan over the last few years. And the current dynamic at the local level seems to be that you have wealthy narcos who are living in luxury condos alongside local business elites. And we've seen that the status quo has been that the overall level of violence has declined over the last few years, but there has been a sense that this peace has been quite fragile. And now we see that with El Mayo's arrest, the status quo has been disrupted, and very quickly we've seen an uptick in violence. And with that in mind, I wanted to ask you, what three words would you pick to describe the role that El Mayo has played in Mexico's criminal underworld?
Right, that's quite a difficult question, but I'll give it my go. I suppose first of all, he's a mythical character. He was the one narco who'd never been to jail until now. He's only given one ever interview in the press. He's not like Chapo. He's not never been a huge fan of the media. He's also a powerful, I suppose, enormously powerful character that really has managed to tie together these often, as you rightly say, these different kind of criminal cells that often are at odds with one another over trade routes, over who gets to traffic where, whose contacts in the United States, etc. And finally, I suppose the obvious one would be now mediator. He's always been the mediator, and you're right. It's a very fragile form of mediation. Um, I remember being in Culiacan just at the beginning of AMLO's term, and the locals were saying basically AMLO or somebody in the government has asked that they need to reduce drug addiction. And as a result, Mayo put out the order, no one's going to sell drugs in Sinaloa. And some people still sold drugs. They were immediately murdered, hung up outside Culiacan, and then drugs were not sold in Sinaloa.
Okay, interesting. So powerful, mythical, and mediator. I think those words are all very helpful for understanding the role that El Mayo has played. Um, we know that in general, Mexico's President Lopez Obrador has championed a policy called hugs, not bullets. And he has appeared willing to negotiate with organized crime groups in order to try and reduce violence. And I'm wondering, when you look at the situation unfolding in Sinaloa right now, what grade would you give Lopez Obrador for his strategy of dealing with Mexico's organized crime groups?
So give me the parameters here. Are we A to D or are we A to F?
We can do A to D and F.
Okay, right. So I suspect, sadly, many people, including particularly on the United States side, in the DEA, would give him a straight F, um, for multiple reasons, and some of them very good reasons. So in the United States, drug overdoses have peaked. They peaked in 2022 at a kind of staggering 111,000. At the same time, AMLO's period in power, has witnessed the country's highest ever homicide figures in 2020. Um, Never a week goes by when you don't hear reports of new industries or economies that are being extorted by the criminal groups, from avocado producers to chicken farmers. And there's also been the usual depressing stories of mass murders, whether it be three Italian students in Jalisco or 11 kids at a Christmas party in 2021 in Guanajuato. And there's also been other depressing stories of military massacres like those caught on camera in Nuevo Laredo in 2023. At the same time, AMLO's, I suppose, public attitude towards drug violence, state repression, has been pretty depressing. He seems to delight in insulting civil society NGOs. He seems to denigrate victims. He excuses the military at every opportunity, while at the same time talking very politely about narcos, like the man he calls not Mayo, but Senor Zambada. Finally, he also appears to have made absolutely no effort whatsoever to improve the completely awful state of the judicial system. Mexico still has too few prosecutors, too few judges, and half a prison population that still awaits trial. So there are many problems, both structural that he's failed to do anything about, and also he's failed to keep in check the more unpleasant, repressive, and not terribly transparent agents of the state. Having said all this, and having said that most people will give him an F, I personally would not grade him quite so low. Maybe a C, maybe a C or a D. As everyone knows, he was dealt a really awful hand. When he came to power in 2018. He came to power basically when the shift from heroin to extremely deadly fentanyl was a fait accompli. There's not much he could have done about that. Homicide rates were already climbing. The cartels were already fragmented and fighting each other, and polycrime was fairly inevitably going to grow, particularly with the fragmentation of the cartels. So what has he done? Well, partially his economic policies have not been that bad. He's managed to double the minimum wage. He's offered pensions to the retired and dug an estimated 6% of Mexico out of poverty. And I think this is part of his. I mean, it's clearly an economic policy, a poverty alleviation policy, but it's also been somewhat, or in his mind, a security policy. The idea being that if you dig people out of poverty, you dissuade some young men from joining organized crime. At the same time, he completely stopped the federal police. Now, this does mean that the Mexico has very limited investigative powers into drug trafficking. It used to be the federal police that did this, but I think everyone agrees, even the DEA, that the federal police was and always has been institutionally corrupt. In actual fact, the former head of the federal police, which was called the AFI, is currently in prison in New York, a guy called Genaro Garcia Luna. So I think many people would have agreed with AMLO that the federal police often did more harm than good. Now, where I do agree with the critics is on the issue of militarization. The militarization of security is really worrying, as is AMLO's drive, his drive to maintain military impunity. However, it does seem, and it seems also in Culiacan, there are orders from on high, whether from the head of the military department, the Department of Defense, or from AMLO himself. There are orders to the military to stay in the barracks. Now, this might well have mitigated against the kind of shoot to kill tactics and the bloody firefights that have really marred the period 2006 to 2018. We know that when the army does leave the barracks, and it has left the barracks on a few occasions in AMLO's term, for example, to arrest Ovidio Guzman, the son of El Chapo, they're pretty violent. Journalists estimated that just to capture Ovidio Guzman, at least 50 hitmen and locals were killed in the attack. So the militarization is worrying. However, it does seem that he's made an attempt to keep some of their violence in check.
Okay, interesting. So many people might give AMLO an F, but you look at some of the positives and you think that he might deserve a C or a D for his strategy of dealing with organized crime. And one thing I did hear when I was in Sinaloa was that Lopez Obrador's social programs have replaced cartel income in many rural communities around towns like Badiraguato, and many people saw that as a positive. And I know that we have seen homicides drop year after year in Sinaloa during Lopez Obrador's presidency. But on the other hand, we also know that Sinaloa has remained one of the worst hotspots in Mexico for violent carjacking. So even when these criminal groups are not battling each other every day in the streets, they do still negatively affect society. And more generally, looking out at the rest of Mexico, we know that Mexico as a whole is right now the worst hotspot in the entire world for both cargo truck hijacking and extortion. And you mentioned this a little bit, but I think that the most cutting criticism of Lopez Obrador's security strategy is that he has mostly ignored policing. And I know that in many cases, relatively small groups of violent and well-connected criminals can still have a huge impact when it comes to crimes such as hijacking, carjacking, and extortion. So when day after day crimes go unsolved and criminal groups continue operating, the impact on society can be enormous over time. And overall, I think it's important to note that Lopez Obrador's administration is marked as the most violent sexenio in modern Mexican history. So the overall level of violence has remained very high during Lopez Obrador's government, and in 2024, homicides are actually up by 2%. So I think that in many ways, Lopez Obrador's legacy in the area of security is going to be defined by how these trends evolve over the next few years, and whether his sexenio will be seen as the start of a real trend of improvement, or whether it just marks a new normal for high levels of violence. And with that in mind, I wanted to ask you, what's one policy recommendation that you have for Mexico's incoming president, Claudia Sheinbaum, if she wants to improve Mexico's security strategy?
Again, that's an extremely good question. Yes, in terms of things like extortion, hijacking, you are absolutely right. I mean, I would argue to a certain extent this was inevitable once the cartels had fragmented into much smaller groups, many of whom, frankly, don't have the capability to do transnational drug trafficking, particularly the ones kind of south of Sinaloa in places like Guerrero or Michoacan. If they don't have contacts with people at the border or with, frankly, people in China, it's very difficult for them to be involved in drug trafficking. So you're right, they've turned to extortion, kidnapping, land theft, and also, as you rightly say, auto theft, which has become a real problem. And frankly, Lopez Obrador doesn't really know what to do with this. He knows how to negotiate with people in large cartels that control large swathes of states like El Mayo. He's much less good. His administration is much less good at managing to police much smaller, much more autonomous gangs that do run now a lot of Mexico. With that in mind, I mean, one thing that people really haven't talked about, except in a slightly, and I'm not sure if we're going to come on to this, but one thing they haven't talked about is a judicial overhaul. There was an attempt by Calderon in 2008 to completely overhaul the judiciary, and this has basically juddered to a halt. And it's really the fact that these crimes go on. The fundamental problem is that there is almost complete impunity for people involved in organized crime. So we know that only about 4% of violent crimes are ever prosecuted. Um, Many of the people that are caught actually aren't the criminals themselves. So I would say if you want one solution, you have to completely overhaul the judicial system, not dissimilar actually to what Italy did when it actually seriously took on the mafia. So the first thing I would do is remove the separate military courts. They set the baseline for impunity. If military do anything, they pretty much always get off scot-free because they have their own courts. They're judged by their own people. And the military hierarchy maintains its own courts as a source of power and pride. At the same time, Mexico has the lowest number of judges per capita in the OECD. You've got to basically make more judges and prosecutors, and you've also got to offer them protection. Otherwise, they're simply going to be intimidated and take organized crimes line. So a country like Mexico that has to send its major criminals, people like Chapo or Mayo, abroad to make sure they're prosecuted, doesn't really have a functional security strategy. You have to have an ability to put these guys in jail with fair trials.
So you mentioned the topic of impunity, and I think that's a really great area to zoom in on. On episode 22 of the podcast, I spoke to journalist Joan Grillo about Mexico's security problems, and we delved into the topic of impunity during that episode. And I know that overall in Mexico, the overwhelming majority of high impact crimes, such as homicide and violent robbery, go unsolved. And in 2022, for instance, nearly 96% of all the crimes reported in Sinaloa went unsolved. And that's pretty much on par with the overall rates of impunity across Mexico. And more broadly, we know that when it comes to rule of law and institutional strength, Mexico is generally ranked among the worst countries in the world. So it really seems like there's a tremendous opportunity for President Sheinbaum to invest in improving the quality of police and prosecutors and in working to reduce impunity. I also wanted to ask you, what's next for Mexico? Will we see somebody step in to take on the role of El Mayo, or are we going to see some kind of new leadership structure emerge in Sinaloa?
Uh, that's a very good question. So I suppose there are two questions here. One is the kind of what's next for Mexico and what's next for Sinaloa. Well, first off, what isn't next is Mexico is not going to suddenly not become the major provider of dangerous narcotics to the United States. I mean, even members of the DEA that you talk to know that his arrest or anyone's arrest is going to do absolutely nothing to stem the flow. Drug trafficking organizations like the Sinaloa Cartel are completely decentralized. They're semi-autonomous, taking out a few so-called kingpins. So we're basically now just mediators. Doesn't do anything but cause violence. And the US market in drugs is pretty impervious to changes in cartel hierarchies down in Mexico. However, and in actual fact, when in Mayo's one brief interview, which he did for Proceso in 2011 with the famous journalist Julio Scherer, he said the same. He said, say that one day I decide to give myself up to the government, which he may or may not have done, so they can shoot me. My case should be exemplary, a lesson to all. They shoot me and euphoria breaks out. But after a few days, we start to see that nothing has changed. The drug dealers know it. The prosecutors know it, the police know it. It does nothing to the drug trade. Now, where Miles' arrest might change things is in the structure, as you rightly say, of the Sinaloa cartel. For over a decade, El Mayo has worked as this mediator between Sinaloa's semi-autonomous drug cells and the political elite. And to a certain extent, and you're absolutely right in saying this is not perfect in any way, shape, or form, he has managed to minimize extreme outbreaks of violence. We've had nothing like, and I think this what they've always tried to avoid are the outbreaks of intra-cartel or inter-cartel violence that really blew up entire cities from 2006 to 2018. So I'm thinking of Ciudad Juarez from kind of 2007 to 2011 when it had more murders than Baghdad at the time. I'm thinking about Nuevo Laredo 2004 to 2005. I'm thinking about Tijuana kind of 2010 to 2012. And I'm thinking about Sinaloa itself from 2008 to 2011, when there was a major conflict between two sides of the Sinaloa cartel, those who followed Chapo and Mayo and those that followed Beltran Leyva. Up to now, those kind of major conflicts have really been kept to a minimum over the AMLO government. So what is going to happen with him gone? So the Sinaloa cartel has prided itself up to now as operating a much more organized, less kind of socially destructive form of drug trafficking. They are not the same as the Zetas or the Gulf cartel, ones that really do a lot of harm to the populaces around. Now, I think this is slightly overplayed. I mean, the Sinaloa cartel has a kind of fairly powerful propaganda arm, corridos, and many people in Sinaloa are in some ways linked by family, by compadrazgo to the cartels. So I wonder whether the Sinaloa cartel, with Mayo gone, with this last vestige of the old school gone, whether they will turn much more into the same will happen to them really that happened to the Gulf cartel. It'll become much more fragmented, and these semi-autonomous drug cells will get more and more involved in other forms of crime. That is extortion, carjacking, kidnapping, and also maybe even drug sales on the streets of Sinaloa, which, as I say, up to now have not been a huge problem.
So, something that you make very clear in your book, The Dope, is that for the last 70 years, Mexican politicians have often nominally backed strategies for fighting organized crime and fighting drug smuggling, but have also actively colluded with cartel leaders. And the general pattern in Mexico has often been that with incoming presidents, the names at the top of the criminal hierarchies may change, but the overall patterns remain the same. And we know that organized crime groups in Mexico continue to diversify away from drug smuggling into other criminal rackets, and that they're also investing in legal businesses. And I know that when I visited Culiacan, I was absolutely blown away by the level of real estate development. And I think that a lot of English language news coverage of the city often focuses on the cartel conflict, but it doesn't explain that it's taking place in the context of visible economic development and business activity.
Yeah, it is kind of extraordinary. I mean, it's like I imagine Miami was in the 1980s. There's an extraordinary amount of investment, which Mayo's been party to. I mean, Mayo owns the milk pasteurizer. I mean, he owns many businesses. He owns a hotel that I stayed at called El Mayo. He also owns the milk pasteurization business. So that's another white product that he monopolizes in Sinaloa. So these people are absolutely imbricated in the business world, and they're actually imbricated with the elites. Their kids are married to the elites, or their kids are compadres with the elites. They go to the same schools. They hang out together. They drive the same kind of cars. They go to the same showrooms.
Definitely. I think that to me is one of the biggest takeaways was just I think that maybe a few decades ago there was this idea that cartel gunmen were coming in from small towns in the mountains and that business elites in the cities were um, a different class, totally separate from them. And I think that for me, one of the most culturally relevant sites that I visited in Culiacan was the Jardines del Umaya Cemetery, where
Yeah.
narco bosses are buried right alongside local business elites in these elaborate shrines. And um,
I mean, I think this was always the case. I mean, there's a case I give in the book, which is basically how the Sinaloa cartel invents what is known as black tar heroin. Well, they invent it because there's an entrepreneurial kind of mountain opium grower, a guy called Lalo Fernandez, who in the 1940s teams up with this woman called Veneranda Batiz, who's a member of really the most elite family, the richest family in Sinaloa, but she's also a chemist. And together they work out how to make black tar heroin in the back of one of her pharmacies. So these alliances, to a certain extent, have always been there. And the Sinaloa elite has just been very clever at managing to distance itself at certain important times from these. I mean, Miguel Angel Felix Gallardo, the head of the Guadalajara cartel, he was on the boards of banks when he was the most wanted man in the United States.
so that's a really great example. And I think for me, I'm honestly not exactly sure what type of cartel structure is going to emerge in Sinaloa following the arrest of El Mayo, but I do think that this underlying power structure where drug money and legal money coexist is going to continue. And I definitely like to encourage listeners of the podcast to check out your book, The Dope. And I just want to say thanks so much for joining us again on the podcast.
No, not at all. That was a delight.
I wanted to take a short break to remind listeners that the Modern Mexico podcast is sponsored by Republica Coffee Roasters. Mexico is known for producing some of the best coffee in Latin America. In Mexico City, one of the best places residents and visitors can buy coffee is the Republica Coffee Roasters Cafe in Colonia Roma. Republica Roasters coffee is also available for purchase online. Thanks for tuning in to another episode of the Modern Mexico podcast. If you like what you heard on the podcast today, check out my book, Searching for Modern Mexico, which is available on Amazon. The next episode of the podcast is coming soon. Until then, hasta luego, amigos.